we welcome you all here for this distinguished panel. So please welcome Matthew Bernstein, the Honorable Roy Barnes, Sandy Berman, Steve Oney, and our beloved, who we can't get enough of, Lois Reitzes.
Thank you. It is an honor for me to participate this evening. I appreciate Leslie's invitation to join with this distinguished panel to explore the legacy of lynching. Memory is essential to our understanding of what came before us. It's also a topic which spans several disciplines and reveals the complexities surrounding how we perceive history, both personal and collective. While these nuances invite probing examinations of what defines memory, there remain facts which are not open for interpretation. In a just society, facts should dominate the outcome of guilt or innocence. That did not happen in the case of Leo Frank. This evening, we will explore the facts surrounding the case, why the presentation of facts was rejected and did not lead to justice, but doom for Leo Frank. The experts gathered here can help us understand the context of this tragedy, why Leo Frank became a scapegoat, and the ultimate horror of his end. To begin, we'll hear from the acclaimed author and journalist Steve Oney, an Atlanta native, educated at UGA and Harvard, where he was a Nieman Fellow. For several years, Steve was a staff writer at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. His first book was the award-winning And the Dead Shall Rise, The Murder of Mary Phagan and the Lynching of Leo Frank. Steve will give us the essential history of the crime, the trial, and the lynching.
Thank you, Lois, and thank you all for being here. So I'm batting leadoff, which means I'm going to play small ball and bring you the facts. And I'm going to try to do it in a way where those of you who don't know much about the Leo Frank case will leave with a basic understanding of what occurred, and those of you who know a great deal about it, and I expect there are many of you in this hall, might glean a new nuance or a little insight and leave with a fuller understanding of what occurred. In simple terms, the Leo Frank case is a double murder mystery. The first murder was that of Mary Phagan on April 26, 1913, Confederate Memorial Day. Mary Phagan was a 13-year-old child laborer. She was strangled to death at the National Pencil Company, which was on South Forsyth Street, roughly where the Sam Nunn Federal Building is today. Little Mary, as she would soon be christened by the press, had stopped at the pencil company to collect her wages at this big industrial concern, $1.20. Then she intended to go to the Confederate Memorial Day Parade, which was on Peachtree Street. She never got there. She never left the factory building. Brutally attacked, likely sexually assaulted, her body was deposited in the factory's filthy basement. The last person to admit seeing her alive was Leo Max Frank, the 29-year-old National Pencil Company superintendent, Cornell-educated Yankee and a Jew. Frank had moved to Atlanta just several years earlier to help establish the pencil company. He married into one of the city's great Jewish families. His wife was the former Lucille Seelig. That's the first murder mystery. What happened to Mary Phagan in that pencil company? The second murder mystery is just as puzzling, maybe more grotesque. On August 16, 1915, a little more than 2 years after the murder of Mary Phagan, Leo Frank, who had been convicted of the crime, was abducted from the state prison farm, which was down in Milledgeville, transported in a caravan of cars on unpaved roads by a circuitous route to Cobb County, the Phagan family's ancestral home. And he was lynched the next day at dawn from an oak tree. The site of the lynching is now paved over by the northbound lanes of I-75, but you can find it. You'll know you're there when you see the big chicken on Highway 41. It happened about 300 yards to the east of the big chicken. What occurred between 1913 and 1915 is at the heart of why the Frank case is remembered today and remains, eerily relevant. The first thing to appreciate about those 2 years, 1913 and 1915, is that America, and particularly the South, were undergoing tremendous, divisive change. The agrarian age was ending, the industrial age was aborning. The murder of a 13-year-old child laborer on Confederate Memorial Day, a symbol of the old fading order, at a noisy modern manufacturing concern, a symbol of the new abrasive and difficult to comprehend age, provided the spark that pitted the past against the future, transforming the Frank case into what it is today and what it quickly became, a national event. Leo Frank's trial took place in a heated atmosphere in a temporary courtroom in the old Atlanta City Hall building, which was across the street from the then newly finished and still standing Fulton County Courthouse. The temperatures inside this temporary courtroom reached 90 degrees, and the mood of the city was possibly even hotter. Atlanta boasted 3 daily newspapers: the Journal in the afternoon, the Constitution, the South Standard newspaper, in the morning, and the Atlanta Georgian, owned and published by the firebrand press baron William Randolph Hearst. And the Georgian was kind of an all-day newspaper that put out a new edition every hour with red, screaming headlines, extra, extra, extra. The trial lasted a month and is endlessly fascinating. The most intriguing element was that the state's star witness, Jim Conley, a janitor at the National Pencil Company, was black. He testified that Leo Frank murdered Mary Phagan after she resisted his sexual advances. Conley said that Frank then dictated 2 very strange notes and asked him to put them beside little Mary's body to point suspicion at another black employee. The notes essentially said, and hang on every word here, this is what was written beside Mary Phagan's body. "Ma'am, that Negro higher down here, a long, tall, black Negro, did it by himself. I write while he play with me." It begs credulity. You should know that Jim Conley was short and coffee-colored, the opposite of the man referred to in the notes. Leo Frank was represented by Atlanta's best trial lawyers, Luther Ziegler Rosser and Reuben Arnold, Mr. Rube in the old school. And Rosser viciously cross-examined Conley, allowing the state's star witness to introduce what he said was a history of sexual entanglements between Frank and female employees. Rosser, in short, inadvertently gave Conley the opportunity to bolster the state's case against his own client. When Rosser moved to strike this testimony, the judge declined, saying, You may be able to remove it from the record, but you cannot remove it from the jurors' minds. Guilty, 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 guilty. Fulton County Solicitor Hugh Dorsey cried as church bells chimed the hour of noon on August 26, 1913. Just 4 hours later, that's the verdict the all-white jury returned. Judge Leonard Roan sentenced Frank to death by hanging. In the wake of Leo Frank's conviction, the gap between the past, the present, and the future that was obvious on the day Mary Phagan was murdered split wide open. As the verdict was appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, the case became a nationwide cause célèbre. The New York Times, published by Adolph Ochs, a Southern Jew whose family still owns the newspaper, articulated the case for Leo Frank's innocence. Thomas E. Watson, a brilliant trial lawyer from rural McDuffie County, the sage of McDuffie County, and publisher of the weekly Jeffersonian, articulated the case for Frank's guilt. Following the failure of Frank's last appeal to the United States Supreme Court, Governor John Slayton commuted Frank's death sentence to life imprisonment, whereupon Tom Watson called for Frank's lynching in the Jeffersonian. The lynching of Leo Frank, no matter how hideous, was a perfect crime. It was orchestrated by the leading citizens of Marietta, seat of Cobb County. It was carried out by Marietta's working men and local farmers. It was funded and tacitly endorsed by the Georgia legislature, which after Frank was successfully abducted from the state prison without a shot being fired, mind you, the most famous prisoner in America abducted from a state prison, the equivalent of San Quentin, without a shot being fired, the legislature appropriated funding to build a new wing at the prison. On Thanksgiving Eve, 1915, the modern Ku Klux Klan was born at a cross burning atop Stone Mountain. The story is that 3 members of the lynch party were present. James Venable, Jimmy Venable, the former Grand Wizard of the Klan, told me this in his late 1980s. When I asked if he could remember the names of those who were there, he said he could not. For some 70 years, Atlanta and Georgia tried to forget the murder of Mary Phagan and the lynching of Leo Frank. The story ultimately reemerged in 1982 when Alonzo Mann, who had been Leo Frank's office boy, came forth with some startling news. He said he had seen Jim Connolly toting Mary Phagan's body in the lobby of the National Pencil Company, and that Connolly had wagged a finger at him and said, "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you." Lonnie Mann was 14, he had a stutter, he was insecure, but he didn't go to his deathbed with this secret. He was not asked about it at the trial, so he had no reason to volunteer it. And late in his life, he came forth in 1982. And I did the last interview with Alonzo Mann in 1984 at a Veterans Administration hospital up in the Tennessee mountains, where he reiterated this story to me. He was dying of congestive heart failure, but he was really the last living witness to the person who knew Jim Connolly, Leo Frank, and Mary Phagan. There have been 2 posthumous pardon proceedings for Leo Frank. The first was declined by the Pardon and Paroles Board. The second, which was a more modest proposition, was accepted by the board. The board essentially said the state of Georgia failed to protect Leo Frank's constitutional rights to be safely held at a state prison. And that's where things stand. There's a movement now to reopen the case, to rethink about it, to ponder it, and I think it's especially of the moment as we enter the divisive world, or we're already in it, we're not entering it, we're deep in it, the divisive climate we now live in, to look back at the Leo Frank case as a warning sign as to where we might end up and how quickly society can go off the rails. But I'm going to leave it to my distinguished fellow panelists to address that. My job, as I said, was a leadoff hitter, and I hope I put a couple runners on base.
Thank you.
Great job, Steve.
While the eyes of the nation were on Georgia, and newspapers as well as organizations throughout the country were voicing their revulsion, the Atlanta Jewish community was traumatized by the gruesome death of Leo Frank. For nearly 3 decades, our next panelist accumulated documents and detailed accounts of Jewish life in Georgia during and after the Leo Frank trial. As the founding archivist of the William Breman Jewish Heritage Museum, Sandy Berman established the largest repository for Jewish historical research in the Southeast, which now includes a significant amount of material related to Leo Frank. Sandy will tell us about the community's response and the impact of Leo Frank's story on the Jews of Atlanta.
Thank you, Lois, and thank you, Leslie, for inviting me here tonight. As Lois just said, my role tonight is to discuss the impact that the Leo Frank story had on the Jewish community of Atlanta. And before I get into that part, I want to backtrack a little in time and discuss a little bit about the Jewish community in general. I'll give you a little background, and I promise you it will be a very abridged version. The first Jews arrived in Atlanta in 1845, Jacob Has and Henry Levy. We never hear from Henry Levy ever again, but the Has family is still in Atlanta to this day. These 2 early German Jews were followed by a number of other German Jews. The community was really comprised mostly of Jews from Germany at this early point in time. They became part of the fabric of the Atlanta community. They were peddlers, they established small businesses, they became part of the whole culture and accepted some of the cultural mores of the South and of Atlanta society. When the Civil War broke out, a number of them fought for the Confederacy. And after the Civil War, more German Jews arrived in Atlanta. In those years, late 1860s, 1870s, businesses were established, some quite large and some quite memorable. Rich's department store was established by 3 German Jewish brothers. Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill was established by the Elsis family, and it at one time became the largest employer in Atlanta. So all of these businesses, including the National Pencil Company, which was established by another Jewish family, were all founded by these early German Jewish families. And the German Jewish community not only established businesses, they were active politically, socially, and economically. Aaron Has in the 1870s was elected mayor pro tem of the city. David Mayer was responsible or credited with saving Atlanta's cotton crop during Reconstruction, and later was credited with establishing the Atlanta public school system. So they were very much a part of the general community, very accepted. They have found a new home in the American South, and the American South had been very welcoming to this German Jewish community. As the decades roll on, more immigrants are arriving in Atlanta. The newer immigrants are coming from Eastern Europe. They don't assimilate quite as quickly as the earlier German Jewish group. They have accents, they dress a little differently, and even the German Jews are a little bit concerned about how this new group will be fitting into their established society. But even in 1903, the community is still so secure in who they are in Atlanta that when a pogrom erupts on June 4th, 1903 in Kishinev, Russia, it makes international news, and Jewish communities throughout America respond. Atlanta was no different, and the Jewish community responded by having a rally to raise money for the victims of Kishinev. The keynote speaker was Henry Alexander, who symbolically or coincidentally becomes one of Leo Frank's attorneys during the appeals phase of the trial. Henry's speech was so remarkable and so lauded by the people of Atlanta that the Atlanta Constitution reprinted part of it on the front page of the paper. I'm going to read you a small little quote from his speech. Persecuted Russian Jews, victims of Tsarist pogroms, were entitled to American citizenship because the spiritual origins of Judaism were in consonance with American ideals. That's how confident Henry Alexander and this group were of their own place in Atlanta and Georgia and in society, that they didn't worry about trying to raise money to bring Russian immigrants into America. There was no concern that this would unsettle their own sense of placement within Atlanta. And yet, just a few years later, by 1913, things had begun to change. There's a major race riot in Atlanta in 1906, and for the first time, the Jewish community is criticized, perhaps, or mentioned in the press that it was the Jewish shopkeepers, the ones who owned pawn shops and saloons on Decatur Street, that were responsible for selling liquor and arms to the black community. This was the first time there was kind of that sense that maybe things were changing. And as Steve already mentioned, the whole we were moving from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. A lot of these factories in the city were owned by Jewish families. Pencil factory, Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. There were two major strikes at Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill during this time period. And then little Mary Phagan gets murdered on Confederate Memorial Day in 1913. And things begin to become, life for the Jews in Atlanta starts to change. It will never again be as secure as they once perceived it to be. Throughout the trial, there is both subtle and overt anti-Semitic comments. Jim Conley states on the witness stand that Leo Frank is not built like other men. But the real problem, and then Frank is, of course, convicted, but the real problem for the Jews in Atlanta didn't really occur until the year of 1914, which Stephen already mentioned was very pivotal because it was the year of the appeals. And the Jewish community made a mistake during this point, or at least in retrospect, historians feel that they made a mistake. They thought it would be in Leo's best interest if they garnered national support for a new trial. So they went up to New York, leaders of the Atlanta Jewish community, Rabbi David Marks from the Temple. They went up to New York to talk to and to speak to Adolph Fox, who at first was reticent to get involved. He didn't want the New York Times to be seen as a Jewish newspaper. He had never really editorialized before for Jewish causes. But he was so then convinced of Leo's innocence that he decided to get on the bandwagon. And from February 24th, 1914 until the lynching, there was not a day that went by that there wasn't an article in the New York Times in support of Leo Frank. And while that may have helped nationally win support for Leo Frank, it did the polar opposite for Leo Frank in Atlanta and for the Jewish community. It was almost like a collective guilt. Tom Watson, the owner and publisher of the Jeffersonian, in his weekly writings, was vicious in his denunciation of the Jewish community, and he equated New York money with Jewish money and said that Jewish money was now going to be controlling the outcome of these appeals. So it was very detrimental for the Jewish community, and they were really starting to live in fear. things got much worse for the Jewish community once the sentence was commuted. The National Guard came out, a mob stormed the governor's mansion. The first time ever the National Guard was called out to protect a sitting governor, and the Jewish community was terrified. A number of them left town, never to return. Others left for a short period of time. We have actually in the archives a diary entry from an Atlanta family where a little girl writes in her diary how her parents came in the night and they hurried off to Birmingham because they were so afraid because of what happened with the Frank commutation. And the community just, it just was paralyzed. And they just laid low. They really didn't do anything. And then only 2 months later, after the lynching, they decided that they could not chance doing anything else to undermine the little bit of security that they felt they had left. So instead of going to the police, instead of pressing the paper, instead of pressing the justice system to find the perpetrators who were responsible for the lynching of Leo Frank, they decided to do nothing. They decided that it was in their best interest to do nothing. They, a good friend of, or the niece, actually the cousin of Adolph Ochs, the publisher of the paper, was asked to write a letter by a good friend of hers in Atlanta, Adelaide Kriegshaber, and to please tell her uncle that the Jews of Atlanta no longer wanted him to be involved in any kind of defense of Leo Frank or to try to help bring any of the perpetrators into the legal system. And when, in doing research several years ago for an exhibition that the Breman put together on the Frank case, the then executive director, Jane Levy, and I traveled to New York to delve into the Adolph Ochs papers, and we found a letter. We had always known that the Jewish community, they were silent. They said nothing. But we didn't know that it was actually, we just thought it just happened. But then we found this letter, and it was unbelievable to our research. It was an epiphany almost, and to actually see it in writing, and I'm going to read to you from that letter now. The conditions here in Georgia are depressing. A number of Jewish people in smaller towns in the state have been boycotted and have been ordered to leave and go elsewhere. Tell Mr. Ochs to discourage all attempts at raising funds to apprehend the lynchers. It will make it only that much harder for the Jews of this state to have outside forces at work. We Jews, a mere handful in a community of prejudiced lawbreakers, cannot do a thing without making it harder for ourselves. We are hoping earnestly that this outrageous conduct will soon be over. The Jews had a meeting of 100 prominent men at the club, probably the Standard Club, the other day, and they agreed that there is nothing they can do without aggravating conditions. They went over the situation and after earnest deliberation felt that for the good of our people, they had better not try to arouse the anger of the mob, for any attempt to bring the mob to justice would be disastrous to themselves. And this sentiment lasted for decades. The Jewish community laid low. They stopped getting involved in politics. They really didn't talk about it. And as Governor Barnes will be addressing the reaction in Marietta soon, that same quiet, no one talked about it in Marietta either. So it was a taboo subject across the board. No one talked about the Leo Frank case. And even in the 1930s, I don't know how my time is. Am I okay? Okay. Even in the 1930s, when Jonah B. Wise, who was head of the Joint Distribution Committee, wrote to leaders of the Atlanta Jewish community to try to establish a welfare fund here to save and help the Jews of Germany, there was not the same reaction as when they rallied to support the Jews of Kishinev. They were so afraid of supporting a Jewish cause, of bringing Jewish immigrants to the United States that may take jobs away from other Americans, especially during the 1930s, which was the Depression, that they were very reticent to establish the Jewish Welfare Fund. It took 3 years of letter writing back and forth between Jonah B. Wise and Harold Hirsch, who was one of the leaders of the community here, to finally convince him, and we all know what was going on in Germany, to finally convince him that a welfare fund needed to be established so that money and effort could start to help the Jews in Nazi Germany. And that situation stayed with the Jewish community for decades. And even when I came here in 1984, I moved to Atlanta in 1984, I was invited by the temple. They were celebrating their 120th anniversary to help them with a small exhibition there. And they were honoring all of the founding families. And when I walked in, there was an elderly woman there, and she was a member of that Has family, descended from that first Has that arrived in Atlanta in 1845, and she looked directly at me and she said, "And Sandy, nothing about that Frank case." So it lasted for decades and no one talked about it. And that is, in thinking about this and thinking about my presentation tonight, I thought about that silence that lasted for decades. And with what's going on today in the world and the rise of anti-Semitism once again, we as Jews can no longer be silent. Thank you.
The inherent drama, mystery, violence, stereotypic characters, and ultimate tragedy of Leo Frank's story have inspired a number of films and media adaptations. Professor Matthew Bernstein began teaching film history and film criticism at Emory University in 1989 and served as chair of the Film and Media Department from 2006 through 2021. He built the department to its remarkable stature within the university and brought it to the public with Emory Cinematheque, a semester-long series of free screenings and lectures on a special topic that everyone is invited to attend. His awards and publications are many, with 3 major projects near completion. And of particular importance for our discussion now is Matthew's book, Screening a Lynching, the Leo Frank case on film and television. As the first scholar to examine the portrayal of Leo Frank's trial and lynching in visual media, he will share his expertise now.
Thank you, Lois. And thank you, Leslie, for inviting me to participate on this distinguished panel. So, as Lois was saying, this story keeps getting told. Between 1915 and 2009, I count 2 feature films, 2 television shows, several documentaries. We're not even getting to Alfred Urey's Parade. The story keeps getting told, as well as in nonfiction books like Steve Oney's and The Dead Shall Rise, which if you have not read, we just happen to have copies for sale. But Steve has done an incredible job. I was looking at the case before Steve, and there's after Steve, and it reads like a novel. I can't recommend it enough. So, as Lois alluded to, the story of Leo Frank is, if you're looking at it from a filmmaker storytelling point of view, it's a mesh of all these different genres, any one of which would sustain an enthralling, compelling film. It's a murder mystery, so it's also a detective story. It's a story of a marriage that is torn apart and grown stronger by external forces. It's a courtroom drama. It's about corrupt, or at least ambitious, politicians trying to exploit a case. It's a miscarriage of justice story. It's about cynical and sensational journalism that helps convict Frank outside the court. It's got all these different elements. It's got a noble governor who acts on principle and conscience instead of public opinion, and it's got a mob's fury in terms of the anger stirred up by Watson, not the lynchers of Leo Frank. So there are all these reasons why anyone would want to tell this story, and I focus in my book, and I'll focus now, on 2 films from the 1930s and then 2 TV programs, one from 1964 and another from 1988. And what interested me about this is you have a historical event and you have 4 very distinct approaches to telling the story. And why are there these 4 different approaches? Well, it depends on the filmmaker's particular concerns at the time. It also relates to the historical context in which these films and TV shows are made. It's said that any film or TV show is kind of a documentary of its own time. And so I want to just talk to you about some of these. What surprised me, one of the things that surprised me was that, we always think about movies reducing and simplifying history. These texts were created with active research, either like just people who knew the case really well, or people who dove into the documents to get it right. They took dramatic license, but that was usually to get at a more abstract truth. And so what you have here are adaptations of a historical phenomenon, a historical event. So, another thing that shapes them are what do people know when they're making these films, at the time that they're making these films. So one film I'm not talking about is The People versus Leo Frank, which is Ben Loderman's PBS documentary from 2009. Excuse me. Steve was a technical consultant. This was the only film made about the case that knew about the important role of Jim Conley's defense attorney, William Smith. William Smith defended Conley successfully, but came to be convinced that Conley was the murderer of Mary Phagan and spent much of his life trying to correct that undertaking of his to defend Conley. So nobody else knew about this until after Steve's book was published, and then William Smith plays a major role. If someone makes a feature film about the case, they will have to have a major role for William Smith. So what are these 4 different films that I'm talking about? The first one is actually, and before I do that, I just put together, I'm a film professor, I've got to have slides. I just put together, images of some of the main figures in the case: Leo Frank, Mary Phagan, Jim Conley, William Smith, bottom left, Tom Watson, and John Slayton, the governor, just so in case. So the first film that addresses this is actually by a black filmmaker, and it's called Murder in Harlem. And it's made in 1935. And it's by this very famous race filmmaker. Race filmmaker means someone who's making films for black audiences expressly. And the filmmaker is the very famous Oscar Michaud. And Michaud claimed like he'd been in the courtroom during the trial, which is absolutely impossible, but he absolutely knew the case and put his knowledge to work in it. Just some of the features of this. You see the main Jim Conley character here in the lobby card with the body of the Mary Phagan character. And this is his discovery, but what the film does remarkably is basically dramatize Jim Conley's testimony on the stand, which was that Leo Frank sexually assaulted Mary Phagan and then asked Jim Conley for his help to move the body to the basement. And here are just a few images from the film, just showing you how Michaud illustrated, dramatized what Conley said. Conley claimed, if you look at the top left image, that Leo Frank regularly hired him to keep a watch out while he had women up for sex in his office. Then in the middle image, you see Leo Frank's character has sent the Mary Phagan character into a storeroom and then walks in behind her to sexually assault her. And then in this third image, Leo Frank has accidentally killed the Mary Phagan character, and he's at the top of the stairs gesturing to Jim Conley to come help him move the body. It was astonishing how closely Oscar Michaud followed the trial. He used actual transcripts, Conley's testimony, as dialogue in his film to describe what had happened. And he depicts Frank as a sexually aggressive womanizer, but he finds someone else who's guilty of the murder. So Frank has behaved badly with Mary Phagan, of course, but there's someone else who kills her. It's her boyfriend, which is totally Michaud's fabrication. And like the ads would be like, there's this incredible twist. You won't believe what the ending is. And it's like, if you knew the case, no, you would never believe. You would never anticipate what that was. What was interesting to Michaud was that the Conley character is a lowlife. He's depicted as a drunk. He's depicted as just not a good person. And why would Michaud do this? Because Michaud was interested in uplift, depicting role models for African American audiences. So Lem Hawkins, the Jim Conley character, is who you don't want to be. He fabricates a completely fictional character, a black lawyer, who actually cross-examines the Conley character on the stand and gets the truth out of him. And that's the kind of person you want to aspire to be. So there's a way in which the Leo Frank case fits in with Michaud's interests, and of course the fact that a black person played such a central role in the case. So that's Murder in Harlem. One other charming thing, and by the way, you can see all of these films, except They Won't Forget, on YouTube. They're there. They're free to watch, I wish that'd been the case when I wrote the book. Anyway, but we won't dwell on that. One charming other aspect of this film is that it's actually the black lawyer's girlfriend who makes all the breakthroughs in the case. So you've got a little like proto-feminism going on there, which is wonderful. The second film from the 30s is this Warner Brothers low-budget production, They Won't Forget. It was directed by Mervyn LeRoy, who was a house director at Warner Brothers at the time. LeRoy is most famous. He made a lot of great and successful movies, Gold Diggers of 1933. But more to the point, he is famous for making another Georgia-based film called I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which was a 1932 expose of the chain gang practice. Of course, Warner Brothers didn't use the term Georgia in the title. They took that out, but authorities in Georgia had no trouble figuring out what this film was about and proceeded to sue the studio. So when Michaud was relying on the public record, They Won't Forget is actually an adaptation of a novel from 1936 called Death in the Deep South. The author was a writer named Ward Green. Ward Green had been an Atlanta Journal journalist at the time of the Frank case, and it had a huge impact on him, as it would anyone doing reporting during the case. Ward Green is best known, as its tangent, fun fact, for writing the story that was the basis of The Lady and the Tramp, the Disney film, but far removed from Leo Frank. But in any case, he fictionalized the Leo Frank case. He updated it to the 1930s, and it's a really astonishing and powerful film because, Oscar Michaud, Murder in Harlem, there's no sectionalism in it. There's no resentment of Yankees. It's set in the North. There's no anti-Semitism in it because it's mostly focused on the black portion of the case. They Won't Forget is taken from this fictional novel. And the filmmakers followed Ward Green's path in not depicting anti-Semitism's role in the conviction of Leo Frank. Why was this the case? Ward Green believed, like many at the time, and some still do, that anti-Semitism was not a factor in the case until relatively late in the game. During the trial, and as Sandy was describing, after the initial trials and appeals had failed, and there was a national appeal. So it's an adaptation of a novel. It depicts major sectionalism. There's resentment of a northern teacher in a business school. This resentment of northerners. It depicts prejudice. There's a black Jim Conley character, but he's not really significant. He gives coach testimony and then recants it, so it kind of cancels things out. It does depict an ambitious politician who makes a deal with a corrupt journalist to share scoops on the case that drive the Leo Frank character, his character, to conviction in the case. The film is limited in what it can show because it's a 1930s Hollywood film. So, for example, it can't bring up some of the seamier or unseemly aspects of the case, like Jim Conley's accusation that Leo Frank he performed sexual acts on women in his employ. Couldn't bring that up in a 1930s film. And it gets at all these other larger factors at work. The journalists are cruel, heartless, manipulative. They play upon public opinion. There's no Tom Watson character, but the resentment of the Leo Frank character is shared by everyone in the town. So that makes it even more ominous in a way. They certainly could not show what a lynching would look like, right? You just couldn't show that explicitly. All these films at the time were made for family audiences. Anyone could walk in and see them. But, jumped ahead. Leroy and his screenwriters came up with a way of depicting lynching without depicting it. So these images aren't of the greatest quality, but here's the Leo Frank character. He's being taken to the state prison, but the train is stopped, and a group is waiting for the train to stop and to greet him. Among the group that's depicted as lynching him are members of Mary Phagan's family, which was not, in fact, the case, but that gives them their passion, when in fact the lynchers were very methodical and calm when they performed the lynching. But in any case, he's taken away by the mob, and then the camera glides over to a train. If you can see at the top right, the train, and there's a mail sack in a human form. And as the train runs by, it grabs the mail sack. And that's how this film depicts the lynching. It's elusive, it's metaphorical, but it's very, very powerful. So I can't recommend this film. I mean, all these films are fascinating, but I can't recommend this enough. It wasn't a big budget film. It was the debut of Lana Turner in the Mary Phagan role. And for those of you who are fans of Captain Ray, what's that actor's name? Claude Rains plays the ambitious prosecutor, and he struggles with a southern accent, but what can you do? The next program I want to talk about now, we're turning to TV, and with TV, the focus goes to John Slayton. There's something about television that favors John Slayton. It's not a coincidence, it's kind of where people find their stories. So Slayton appears in They Won't Forget, but very, very briefly. Profiles in Courage. I don't know how many of you knew. I didn't know when I started writing the book. There was a TV series based on JFK's book, Profiles in Courage. And that book had several chapters. This man on the right, Robert Sadek, this is before PBS. He produced public interest documentaries and shows. Here he is talking with JFK about the series in 1961. They needed more people to tell stories about. They could dramatize all the chapters in the book, but they looked for more. And somehow they found John M. Slayton. And the consultant on the series was Kennedy's special advisor and speechwriter, Theodore C. Sorensen. And Sorensen wrote to, he was very involved in at least the research for Profiles in Courage. And he wrote to Sadek and said, had the president known about John M. Slayton, I am certain he would have wanted to write a chapter about him. And about John Slayton, because of what he did, he agreed to hear Leo Frank's appeal for mercy, for commutation of his sentence from death to life imprisonment. And then he decided to commute the sentence after reviewing trial transcripts and actually visiting the pencil factory, going over everything. And he became convinced that there was a lot of ground for reasonable doubt that Frank was guilty. So they make Profiles in Courage. It begins after Frank has been convicted, and it's about what John Slayton is going to do. So it follows him out in that process. It shows a mob scene at night at the conviction of Frank, which is charming visually because you have all the torches that we're afraid of in the South mobs. Of course, the conviction came during the day, but this is better visually. And it's just really good 60s drama. Yes, so one of the other charming things about this production is that Walter Matthau, who called himself the Cary Grant of Ukraine, plays Governor Slayton. He, this New York Jewish guy is playing Governor Slayton. And almost as comical is Michael Constantine. I don't know if you recognize that name. I'm going to date myself. He played the principal in Room 222. But more recently, he was the dad in My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Very proud Greek dad. He plays Tom Watson. So you got both these guys who are not from the South, and they duke it out. And again, dramatic license. They conceive of a scene where Watson comes to Slayton, this never happened, and says, don't you dare reinvestigate the Frank case, or I'm going to rouse up my people against you, and you are going to suffer for it. So he's really, it's really, they toned him down in revising the script. Someone had to point out to him, Tom Watson was a very literate, intellectual book author. You're portraying him as a total redneck, and that's not. If you watch it, see how you think they did. Anyway, so Slayton carries on with what he does, and here the concern is the concern of Profiles in Courage, the 1960s, the civil rights era, and the goal of the book was to inspire Americans with the example of people who acted on conscience and ideals and did not be swayed by public opinion. And so that's John M. Slayton in that role. When the shows were reviewed, or actually I saw a correspondence where people were talking about, Barry Goldwater, 1964 Republican Convention, and the platform there, and they were comparing that to the reactionary strains depicted in Profiles in Courage. I should also mention that They Won't Forget appeared during the ongoing saga of the Scottsboro Boys, right? The teenage black men from Alabama who were repeatedly accused of raping a white woman on a train, though there was constant evidence that refuted that. The Supreme Court reversed it. Alabama didn't care. They kept after it. So They Won't Forget was resonant as a depiction of Southern injustice. So, how am I doing on time, Lois?
You should wrap up.
I should wrap up, okay.
We want Governor Barnes.
So diplomatic. The last thing I'll call your attention to, again, this is on YouTube. This is like the big kahuna. This is a 1988 miniseries called The Murder of Mary Phagan. It's got this all-star cast. It was produced by George Stevens Jr. It's made after Alonzo Mann's revelations, and they actually have footage of him showing up, in this image on the lower right, on set of a National Pencil Factory. It has Alonzo Mann as a character in the film. He shows up in the epilogue. It's like It's like it combines every other previous film or TV show into one. Part one is about the Leo Frank trial, the prejudice, the sectionalism, the anti-Semitism. It's all there. Corrupt reporting and corrupt politicians. Part two is like they took Profiles in Courage and expanded it. So part two is all about Slayton reinvestigating the case. And of all these productions, it's the biggest budgeted. It's shot on location in Richmond. They actually recreated a pencil factory. You got Jack Lemmon as Governor Slayton. You've got Peter Gallagher as Leo Frank. Other actors not so familiar, Kevin Spacey plays the corrupt reporter. Here's a scene, Jim Conley on the stand with Frank's lawyer failing to break him as he makes all these assertions about Frank. And so this is also the most rounded depiction of Conley, even more rounded than in Oscar Michaud's film, because they don't have that axe to grind. So yeah, the final thing I'll say just to wrap up is, as Lois has talked about and as Sandy has talked about, the Leo Frank case is a traumatic incident in our history. And there's a way in which people are telling the story on screen so powerfully, not just because it's a great story, but because they really believe in the miscarriage of justice and that people need to know about it and people need to be vigilant. It's a type of working through trauma. Each of these films is kind of trying to work through what actually happened and why. So there's that kind of serious effort that's going on. And again, it just demonstrates that mass media can represent complexity and accuracy in historical events, and that they help us keep the memory of these events alive. So thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Matthew. So we heard in 1983 that the State Board of Pardons and Paroles denied a posthumous pardon to Leo Frank, even though Alonzo Mann had come forth after 70 years. In 1986, the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles issued the posthumous pardon for Leo Frank, but did not exonerate him. With his ties to the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish community of Atlanta, the late Congressman John Lewis was steadfast in his support of a pardon, and in 2018, he wrote to the Georgia Department of Transportation advocating for the placement of an anti-lynching memorial. The anti-lynching memorial at the Georgia Department of Transportation was designated the Leo Frank Memorial Site. That was 3 years after then Governor Nathan Deal opposed reopening the Frank case to issue a pardon a century after the lynching. Former Georgia Governor Roy Barnes, the Honorable Roy Barnes, has worked hard for many years to vindicate the outcome of Leo Frank's case. In addition to his extensive research into the legal aspects of Frank's trial, Governor Barnes has deep personal involvement with the subject, as he will explain in his legal and moral reckoning of the case.
I was born and raised in Cobb County, and back when it was a rural county, and I was born in 1948, my daddy ran a dairy and farmed and ran an old general merchandise business. that our family still runs, in fact. My grandfather started. It's been at the same location for 95 years. And the Leo Frank case was kind of, as Sandy was talking about, it was an unspoken secret. Nobody talked about it, because you're going to talk about somebody's cousin or uncle or granddaddy if you got into it. I was always interested in the case, and when I would ask my daddy about it, he'd say, well, we just don't talk about that. We just don't. Now, you can't blame the Barneses. We didn't get there to 1919. We were still making liquor in North Georgia in 1914.
The Lord's work.
The Lord's work. But when Steve, I'm going to tell this one thing about Steve. Steve came to see me when he started this book. Judge Luther Hames, who had been the law partner of the chairman of the prison committee, the way I believe they got in down there. He practiced law with him, John Tucker Dorsey. And so Judge Hames told Steve, says, Roy's been interested in this case and all, and says he's talked about it a lot and he's researched it, so go over and see him. Steve came over there and he told me he was going to be there about 6 months. He ended up staying 8 years, I think it was. We got to know him very well in Cobb County. And when Steve printed when Steve book came out, I will get Otis Brumby this credit. He printed the names of everybody that was involved on the front page of the newspaper, even though he was kin to some of them. And on there was my wife's grandfather, Cicero Dobbs. The Dobbs, an old family there. And Otis Brumby's mother was a Dobbs. And he owned a cab company there. Now, Mary did not know it. I had found it out through Bill Kinney, because his mother was a Dobbs too. Like I say, incest is best in Marietta. And so, and I always encouraged Kenny. I said, over the years, I said, Kenny, you need to write all this up. And he said, well, what are you going to tell Mary? What am I going to tell Otis? He worked for Otis Brumby at the newspaper. I said, I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. But the point is, it was so well kept a secret. Mary did not know it. Now, she's uncomfortable about it. She was only 2 years old when her grandfather died. But Otis wrote the story, and the reporter called Mary, and she had a wonderful statement. She says, well, I don't remember my grandfather, but perhaps if I had known him, I could have talked him out of it and taught him better, which was a great thought. I thought she handled it with grace and very well. Just like the Jewish community didn't talk about Leo Frank, neither did the Marietta community. Now, when I've just told you about the Dobbs, but Herbert Clay was in the midst of this. I guess y'all have heard of General Lucius Clay, and you've heard of Senator Clay, and his descendant is Chuck Clay, who was in the state Senate. All of these folks were involved. Steve and I have had this conversations over the years. What was it that led the best members of the community, the leading folks of the community, to lose their head and lynch Leo Frank? And Steve's got, I think, the best argument there, and Sandy talked about it too. After the Civil War, everything was just frozen for so long because everything had been destroyed. And by the turn of the 20th century, all of these forces that have been talked about, the change from agrarian to an industrial, it's unsettling And you know what happens, and we're living in an unsettled time right now. And you know what you do when you live in unsettled time? You find a boogeyman to blame. It happens to be immigrants, Hispanic immigrants right now, and Jews, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So this case, has continued to have significance, not only because it has all this, Matt said, about the novel basis of so interesting effects, it's because it shows us what happens when extremism takes over. And we see it on a regular cycle in American history. And as I said, we're going through one right now. So that's the reason this case is taken on a life. And while we talk about it, even though it was over 110, 15 years ago, we still talk about it because it has modern, current relevance. It shows what happens when you follow a mob and a person like Tom Watson, who was brilliant. He wrote one considered to be one of the finest histories of France. That's ever a multi-volume history of France. He was brilliant, but he took that brilliance to incite for murder because it was politically expedient. He hated Hoke Smith. That was another reason. Hoke Smith was governor. But Hoke Smith also was at the Atlanta Constitution, on the Atlanta Constitution, or was it a journal? It was Atlanta Journal. He hated, and some say that it was just to get at Hoke Smith that he took after. I don't believe that. You can't read the Jeffersonian and see those red headlines and the vicious attacks that he had for all of 2014 without recognizing that there was a moral absence. And so the story we learn from Leo Frank is one that we should remember. Do never allow one person or one group to be victimized and to blame all of the troubles of the world on it, because it's not true. And it shows your lack of moral compass when you do that. Now, I want to tell you, you said, well, that was, a long time ago. I served on the ADL board for several years, and several of you here, I'm sure, have been involved with ADL. The number of anti-Semitic acts that is on the increase. All you have to do is go on social media, and it's vicious. It's as bad as anything that Tom Watson ever wrote on some of these. I'll tell you this story that I had, when I was governor, I appointed Bobby Kahn, who was my campaign manager, he's Jewish, as my chief of staff. And he was the first Jewish person to ever be chief of staff for a governor. We got all kinds of mail. It shocked me, to be quite frank with you. I didn't think anybody would pick it up or care, That's how wrong I was. And I've been very vocal in saying that Leo Frank needs to be exonerated. And there is an effort right now of where we've gone before the integrity unit of the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, and they have an active investigation about whether to vacate the conviction which exonerates Leo Frank. But even today, as you've heard from Lois, even modern governors and modern pardon and parole board members, they're reluctant to do anything. And there are some folks out there, as I've given speeches over the years, I've had folks that show up and dispute what I said. But about 2 years ago, I came back from court one day, and my assistant said, you got an FBI agent that's been calling 2 or 3 times that wants to talk to you. I said, well, give me his number. So I went back there, and he answered the phone. And I said, this is Roy Barnes. I said, whatever you claim, I didn't do it. And he laughed. He said, no, he said, that's not what I'm calling you about. I said, well, what do you call me about? He said, you got a fellow that's really after you. He says, you know, we listen to folks. I said, so I've heard. He says, you got a fellow that's really after you. He said, this fellow's dangerous. He said, we prosecuted him up in Pennsylvania. He served some time, and says he's a trainer in a militia training group up in North Georgia. And I said, well, what's he after me about? The changing the flag? That's what I get, you know, most of the ones that fuss at me is about changing the flag. He said, no. He said, he claims you're too close to the Jews. I said, you got to be kidding me. He said, are you sitting at your computer? I said, yeah, I'm sitting at my computer. He said, let me give you this address. He gave me this address, and I typed it in. It comes up. And it had me, I'd spoken to AJC at one time, American Jewish Committee, and Rabbi Lebo is a good friend of mine who he and I have worked for years on the Leo Frank case, and they had a picture of Rabbi Lebo and me standing there and talking and everything else, and it was scandalous what he was saying. Now, this is 2 years ago, folks. 2 years ago. The reason that Leo Frank is relevant today is to show folks that they have to have moral courage to stand up, or it will happen again. And in the life and the circumstances we live today, it is ripe for anti-Semitism. It's ripe for anti-immigration. It's right to find somebody that we can blame for the changes that we are uncomfortable about. How many jobs are going to be taken by AI? How many jobs are going to be taken by robots? You gotta blame somebody. And who's been blamed before? For centuries, it's been the Jews. And they've been the scapegoat. And we cannot allow that to ever happen again. Thank you.
I had a couple of questions that I hoped each of you would answer, but your presentations have gone beyond what I could have hoped. Just one thing I would love for each of you to take on, if you would. And Governor Barnes, this follows what you have been cautioning. 2 years ago, neo-Nazis protested outside of the Broadway theater where the musical Parade was in its very successful revival. 4 months ago, Kingsley Wilson, the Deputy Press Secretary for the Department of Defense of the United States of America, came under scrutiny for messages she had posted on X stating, Leo Frank raped and murdered a 13-year-old girl. He also tried to frame a black man for his crime. Wilson's comments about Frank are so disturbing because they so closely align with neo-Nazi talking points. This fomenting hatred. So, as the Leo Frank case still appears in anti-Semitic rhetoric today, how can we use the example to fight hate and injustice toward the other?
Well, I'm a journalist, and I'm not an advocate, and so much of what passes for today's conversation is advocacy and bias confirmation from one side or the other. People are looking to confirm their own deeply held, passionate points of view. I reject that as a way of looking at the world. I choose to look at the world by trying to give an accurate, dramatic, interesting account and answer what I believe is the most important and sacred question of journalism and truth-telling, which is simply what happened. And if we can stick to that idea in our American conversation and in the business I'm in of telling true stories as well as I can tell them, I think we can go a long way toward defraying the kind of hostility and balled up fists and ready to engage in verbal violence or worse. I may be too optimistic in believing that, but as a nonfiction writer and somebody who's been at this for 50 years, that's what I can do, and that's what others in my profession, which is struggling in its own right, can do. Try to tell the truth as best you can and hope that reasonable people will read it and respond accordingly.
Sandy.
I concur with everything you just said, and also I think that we need to keep promoting the Frank case or talking about the Frank case in all kinds of media, all kinds of formats. So we have the Frank collection at the Breman Museum. There's an exhibition about the Leo Frank case at the Breman Museum. So a museum is another way of learning about the facts. Or visit the Breman and ask to see the archival collection so that you can learn the facts firsthand. Or go to see the musical parade, because it doesn't matter how you discover the truth. It only matters that you're searching for the truth. When I was in New York and I saw a parade with my daughter and my sister and niece, I already knew the story. But sitting behind me were three individuals, and I think they just must have bought tickets because they could get a hold of tickets for a Broadway musical. They didn't know anything about the story, and I was eavesdropping on their conversation. And they were so amazed and in awe and so excited to learn about this part of American history. And they had no idea that the Frank case, they had never heard of Leo Frank. So however we can bring it to the awareness of these kinds of what happened, the truth about what happened, I think that we'll be able to move forward.
Sure. These kinds of comments, we've talked about how extreme views in the last decade or so have become mainstreamed. They've become very acceptable. The mainstreaming of extreme views is a real problem. That's what we're talking about in this instance. What I think about is how do we go where people are? And how do we tell the story? How do we get the museum archives to people where they are? And I think it really should take a major social media effort. You can't tell the truth about the Frank case in a TikTok video, but if it's online and it's what people are using, and we've learned about how important social media is in political elections and everything else. I just feel like we have to keep telling this story for all the reasons Governor Barnes talked about, but we need to be able to do it in a way, on a platform that's really going to reach people and challenge the narratives that are already out there. So that's what I would suggest, because this is only going to get worse. With AI taking over, the fabrications, all the things that Steve fights against, it's really going to get horrific. And people are going to have an even harder time telling the truth from something that's made up and confirms bias. So anyway, that's my thoughts about where to deploy the Leo Frank case and keep telling it.
I've thought about this for a long time, not only on Leo Frank, but the other issues that we have of the day. The problem we have is we were always told that there was an absolute truth. That's what it is. Now we're told in the public domain, well, those are alternative facts, that there is no such thing as the truth, that the truth may vary according to who you are. Now that's disturbing development, and I don't know the answer to that. I do know the answer, however, that you cannot sit idly by, that you have to speak up. If you don't speak up, and listen, I understand how difficult it is to speak up. I got kin folks, that think Trump is, wonderful, which I told him, I said, "Are you sure you're kin to me?" And but the point is that I shouldn't have said that. But anyway, the point is you cannot shut up. You have to speak up. You have to encourage, and when you have to tell folks, listen, let me tell you this story. You tell them the Leo Frank story, or you tell them the story about ICE picking up a fellow that's landscaper, has been here 30 years, and has got 3 sons that are Marines and fought for the United States, and we've put him in a ICE detention. I mean, you need to speak up about those things and say it's just not right.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your insight. We will not forget this evening. Steve Oney and Matthew Bernstein will be signing books. Thank you.